Hello, it's Toby here. As a prelude to the conversation you're about to hear, I have to say I think it was genuinely one of the most important topics I've ever discussed on this podcast. But there was a technical issue with the sound of one of our guests. Actually, it was a pretty severe problem that meant that both the recording and the backup recording were irretrievably muffled and distorted. Or at least it would have been irretrievable for yours truly with my very third-rate audio editing skills. But this was then the perfect opportunity to try out an AI audio processing tool, which I saw a while ago but have not yet had cause to use. And I have to say, I'm very impressed. I mean, you could be the judge, but the result is so good actually that with the exception of the occasional moment, which you might not even notice, the recording is now completely comprehensible. It's not quite sharp studio quality, and you can hear that, but believe me, if it wasn't for the AI, you would not even be able to listen to this episode at all. And that would be a real shame since, as I said, I think it might be the most important topic we've ever covered. So I, for one, welcome our new robot overlords, and you should too, at least for the next hour or so. Enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to the Science for Policy podcast. My name's Toby and today I'm joined by Professor Eystein Jansen and Ole Øvretveit. Professor Jansen is based at the University of Bergen, where he is a leading researcher on ocean sciences and climate change, especially as regards the Arctic and the subarctic. He founded the Bjerknes Centre for Climate Research and he's a vice president of the European Research Council. And Ole Øvretveit is a former director of Arctic Frontiers, an organisation which, among other things, hosts an annual conference for scientists, policymakers, and others to discuss issues related to the future of the Arctic region. He's also led a regional think tank for Western Norway and was the director of Science to Policy for SDGs at the University of Bergen. He's now the manager of the pilot project Coastal Development Centre in Kirkenes. And finally, he was one of the co-editors of the book Building Common Interest in the Arctic Ocean with Global Inclusion. So, Eystein and Ole, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
So we're going to talk about science and policy in the Arctic. And as a way into that, for me at least, I remember a long time ago on this podcast, we did have an episode about the Antarctic, and that was with Natasha Gardner. So it's in a way satisfying to top and tail, as it were, and talk now about the Arctic too. But the first question that springs to my mind, in my relative ignorance about the whole thing, is whether there are commonalities between the two. If you're an expert on Arctic science, as indeed the two of you are, does that mean you also know a bit about Antarctica, or are they just completely different animals?
Oh, they are similar in the sense that they are both polar regions, but they are very different. Antarctica is land and ice. The Arctic Ocean is the ice is floating, and of course Antarctica is almost uninhabited. But around the Arctic there are peoples, countries, geopolitical interests. So it's much more complex in the Arctic in that sense.
Yeah, I would like to add to that it's also the Antarctic is governed by a treaty. The Arctic is governed by the 8 nations and the law of the sea.
Okay, so there's no special agreement about the Arctic. It's just managed by the regular law of the countries who happen to own it. And as you say, law of the sea.
Yeah, the Arctic is like most other places of the world. It's governed by national jurisdictions and the interest of the states that has the ownership to these areas.
Okay, but it is more than just an ocean. I mean, not only has it got ice on it, as you say, but it has quite a few other special features that make it much more interesting. I guess it's a bit more complicated to govern an area like that than somewhere relatively more boring, like, I don't know, the Atlantic Ocean. Sorry to Atlantic Ocean scholars, no doubt that's very interesting too, but I mean, not interesting in a geopolitical sense like the Arctic is.
I mean, definitely, because the Arctic is a place where 8 nations also meet. It's a sparsely populated area with resources and with a lot of information that is important for the whole development of the whole planet. So it's obviously a more complicated area than an empty part of the world, but it's still not an area that has been a lot of conflict happening, as opposed to some of the discourse that has been going on about the race to the Arctic, the fight over Arctic resources. Conflicts are being solved to a very large degree, in through diplomatic channels and in just regular discussions in the UN, in the law of the sea bodies.
The Arctic is of course an ocean, so parts of the Arctic is an ocean, but there are also land areas that are governed by the national states that border the Arctic. But it's true, as Ole says, that normally things have been working okay diplomatically in the Arctic. It's been an area of scientific interest, so that the scientific exploration of the Arctic has led to lots of contacts between the different countries, even during the Cold War. The big military superpowers have lots of interest in the Arctic. So it's not without military interest or geopolitical interest, which so far has been handled quite nicely.
Yeah, it's a greater challenge that the war further south will spill into the Arctic than countries will make war over Arctic issues, if that makes sense.
Well, given that we're having this conversation in summer 2023, there are some elephants in the room there, which I can already sense we're working our way towards. But I would just like to make sure I've got my head around the status quo before we talk about any elephants. So we have here a complicated and important area of the world, which is shared by 8 countries and has no particular special rules governing it, which in the case of Antarctica, I recall being told it was invaluable to making the whole thing run smoothly. So how have we got away with this so far in the Arctic? I mean, if you think about other areas of the world where there are these multiple dimensions of geopolitical interest and clashing territorial claims and so on, history has no shortage of wars, frankly, over those kinds of areas. Why has the Arctic been a relatively peaceful issue? Is it just that it's too cold and annoying for anyone to really care about? Like there's nothing to fight over?
Well, I think it hasn't been high on the radar of geopolitics in some sense. But of course, the Russians have the big fleet base in the Arctic. They need to go through Arctic waters to get out into the other waters from those bases. The Americans have lots of interest militarily. But that hasn't been leading to conflicts. And I think one reason is that there has been some understanding and some contact between the Arctic nations that has toned down the potential tensions. The Arctic Council is one body that has been very important in achieving that.
I think that operating in the Arctic is very, very complicated. Be that if you have scientific operations or industrial operations. There has been talk about oil exploration the last couple of decades in the Arctic. It's enormously complicated once you get, deep into the Arctic, because you're so far from everything. So to do that, the actors need to collaborate across borders to make that happen. And the same is the issue on major scientific operations. It's just rational to work together to do things. And that is also even though there are resources there, they are not as vital for either of the 8 Arctic states. I would presume that they would, go to any military conflict over them. But as Eystein says, it's a very strategic, geostrategic, military strategic hotspot because of the short distance between the continents, and both the Russian Northern Fleet and the NATO, being more present in the North Atlantic and into Arctic areas, perhaps these days. That's obvious.
If you look at the map in a polar projection, there's not such a large distance between US territory and Russian territory.
Huh. Yeah, of course, you realize how close things are together when you look from the top down.
I just one last point here. This science, diplomatic, and people-to-people architecture or system that was initiated at the Cold War, where scientists and different actors also had started working together on pressing issues that moved across borders, especially in both air and ocean in the Arctic, became visible. And it created an opportunity to build collaboration systems and or institutions for cross-border collaborations. And it grew very fast from the end of the Cold War and until, well, at least until 2014. But we have also seen new initiatives and big projects going on after that. So this structure has sort of made a platform or an arena to solve issues and to keep sort of amalgaming the different interests.
Okay. Well, if it's not too late in our conversation, perhaps you could sketch out what those institutions look like, what kind of things have built up over the years to manage collaborations in the Arctic.
Yeah, the Arctic Council and the International Arctic Research Commission, the International Barents Secretariat, also the Arctic Sign Ministerial, and you have the Arctic Science Agreement. So there's a big nexus of agreements and organizations and institutions. But of course, the most important, the central institution would be the Arctic Council with its working groups. And
I think it also should be mentioned when we talk about the Arctic Council that there are 8 Arctic nations who are the members, but there are numerous countries all over the world who are observers and to various extent take part in the groups and activities of the Arctic Council, including China, Japan, Singapore, South Korea. Nations positioned on the equator are observers because they somehow feel that the Arctic is important for various reasons. Not least climatic research reasons, but also for other strategic interests they may have.
Yeah, good. I mean, so we're starting to get onto the topic of science for policy. And this is where I think what you just dropped in there is actually very interesting indeed, because, I mean, perhaps naively, I assumed to start with that the reason it was important to study the Arctic was because the Arctic is interesting, and the same reason that we study, I don't know, Mars, because Mars is interesting. And a secondary reason might be so that we understand how to manage and protect the Arctic, not Mars. But then what you said just points to another reason, which I've also read a bit about, which is that one major motivation for studying the Arctic is not to understand the Arctic in itself, but in fact to help us understand other areas of science and tackle challenges in other parts of the world, or indeed across the whole world, like climate change. Could you perhaps say a little bit more about that, the role of Arctic science in global science and policy making?
Yeah, it is, from my perspective, being a climate researcher, the Arctic is very important. Some people say what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. So it influences the global climate system on a much larger scale than the area itself. And the Arctic is also where global warming is happening fastest. So it's some way a canary in a mine type of situation where you can see almost year by year the sea ice cover over the Arctic is diminishing and permafrost areas are melting and so forth. So it has a big impact on the global climate system. And of course it exchanges with the global climate system. So what's happening to the south of the Arctic makes a larger presence in the Arctic now than it used to be. So in terms of weather systems or ocean currents. So this makes it an important part of understanding, predicting and forecasting what will happen to the global climate, which of course should be of interest to any policymaker.
Yeah, and also as far as how operations or knowledge from the Arctic has been influencing policy processes in other areas of the world, the work of the working groups under the Arctic Council, what they have been producing has also had an impact on various processes. Yeah, I could mention the persistent organic pollutants agreement also has been implemented like globally. Also, interesting to mention when we talk about, we have like two poles, the north and the south, but we also started talking about the third pole, which is the Himalaya region, and the third pole initiative are working to sort of understand and collaborate better because of the enormous importance of the Himalayan water as a water source for the countries surrounding it. There needs to be better collaboration. This initiative has also been very inspired by the work done in the Arctic, like the Arctic Council and so on.
Okay, right. So the work done in the Arctic as a model for other parts of the world where you also have great scientific importance and, I guess, complicated geopolitics.
Yeah.
And I think we should also mention in the Arctic is the second largest ice mass in the world, the Greenland ice sheet, which contains about 7 meters of sea level. So changes there in terms of melting the ice sheet, which is happening today, is the single most important factor in global sea level rise.
Wait, so 7 meters of global sea level?
Yeah, if everything melts.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so if you're in a coastal city with a relief of 1 meter, then you can imagine. So what's happening in the Arctic or with the Greenland ice sheet will have global repercussions, regardless of what we do. And it already has.
Yikes. So you're sketching a model of the interface between science and policy where it's touching, as it were, at both ends. You've got the research being done, which is very important for policymakers around the world so that they can deal with climate change. But you've also got the other end of the process, which is the very important role that policymakers play in making that research possible at all. Because of the special nature of the Arctic, it's not like you can just go out into a field behind your house and take measurements. You have to have policy there to enable the research to take place at all. I start to see why this place is so interesting to study.
Yeah, it's also an area of immense beauty. So if you ever have the opportunity to go to the Arctic before it melts, I would strongly advise.
Well, from a man who lives on the west coast of Norway, which is undoubtedly the most beautiful place I've ever seen, that's quite a recommendation. Anyway, so I think we now understand why the scientific work that's done in the Arctic is so important, but you've already hinted quite strongly, and listeners will also have guessed, no doubt, that this is now under threat in a way that it hasn't been historically, even at times when the geopolitics and the kind of external policy-making environment has been very challenging. So broadly speaking, where do we stand right now?
Broadly, the Russian invasion of Ukraine made the Western governments and the EU act quite swiftly to stop all collaboration between Western and Russian science institutions. And also there was a pausing in the work of the Arctic Council and their working groups. Now that has started to re-emerge as Norway has taken over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council, but without Russia. But there has been, major research projects that overnight has been, if not shut down, then the Russian partners had to be cut out. Data from Russian partners could not be used. So this has been, I think, for many working on this has been a very troublesome time.
Yeah, can I just ask, just like really practically, can you do this stuff without Russia? I mean, you say the work of the Arctic Council is resumed without Russia. Does that make any sense?
It depends a bit on what kind of research it is. Some of the research is based on field measurements on Russian territories, and that cannot be done now by Western institutions. And Russia is also a large part of the Arctic, so to get a holistic view of what's happening in the Arctic, you definitely would need data from Russia. Some of it is coming still through the World Meteorological Organization, for instance, which has a network of meteorological stations. The land surface temperature is still being recorded in a decent manner. That's organized by the UN. But of course, work in territorial waters of Russia is not happening, and that's a major part of the Arctic Ocean. The measurements of methane emissions from thawing permafrost, which is one of the big unknowns in climate research, cannot be done in a similar way they have to then rely on North American observations. But the biggest part of the permafrost areas are in Russia, in Siberia. So you can say partly one can continue, and one can still observe remotely from satellites, but in situ measurements or campaigns or experiments that depends on the Russian territories cannot be done. And of course, Russia has also provided infrastructure for logistics to support Western-led expeditions, and that cannot be done either.
Yeah, and as far as strategies goes for Western institutions, we see Norwegian universities and others looking to work closer with other Western partners. So, but they previously has been looking eastward, they're now looking westward to Canada or to work on Greenland, and also to work closer in a Nordic context.
And then, so the war in Ukraine has been going on for well over a year now at the time of recording. What are the potential implications if this continues?
Well, Russia is 45% of Arctic territory. So if it's shut down or data don't come out from Russia and knowledge don't come out from Russia, I think that our understanding of Arctic climate and Arctic ocean system, but also, on a societal level, which is social scientific data, resilience and so on, which there has been a lot of good science collaboration done on, we will not have that understanding. And of course, that will make general knowledge about Arctic development much, much weaker. Long-term consequence is that this whole Arctic science collaboration system that has been developed through decades and may have been developed out of special circumstances, if it goes like 5-10 years where we don't have any collaboration with Russian partners, the chances are great that it will collapse and it will be more difficult to restart it. That's also a big challenge for the understanding of the Arctic region and its consequences on the rest of the world for decades.
If I may add here, there is one aspect which deals with the indigenous peoples. There are a number of indigenous peoples around the Arctic, also in Russia. And the thawing of tensions after the Cold War and the emergence of this architecture of collaboration has helped a lot in terms of indigenous peoples meeting each other and having their voice heard. And now there is it's very difficult to continue this in terms of collaboration with those indigenous peoples that live in Russian territories. It's not so many people, but it's an important aspect of this freezing of collaboration. I would also say that we would, over some time, lose critical information on the state of the global climate system, which every nation should be interested in. I'm thinking of, particularly which I've mentioned earlier in this conversation, the state of the permafrost, the emission of greenhouse gases from the permafrost, the reflectivity of the planet, the speed of changes, and also possible disruptions of the ocean circulation, which would depend on data coming in from Russia. So from a policymaker point of view, losing these data and this information, if it goes on for some years, will be very difficult. You cannot interpolate the data. You just have a big hole in your database.
Yeah. Yeah, well, so what do we do about this? And I mean, not just what's your view, but also, is there any kind of a unified view within the scientific community?
I think from the people I've spoken to, and my impression is that everybody's have the deepest understanding that there needs to be strong reactions from the West towards the Russian aggression. And of course, Norway being and Ukraine is a neighboring country to Russia. and Norway is too. There's no real fear of Russia invading Norway, but we have to make a very strong stand on that this is not okay, and violating international law is not okay. But having said,
I mean, although it's also in your favour that it's quite a long march from the Russian border to any well-populated parts of Norway, which is not true about Finland.
Yeah, that's true. But I don't think that it's not on the Russian agenda to look to invade Norway unless there will be like a full-scale war between Russia and NATO.
No, agreed.
But it's still important to make a firm stand from the West. But I think this reaction, shutting down science projects, science collaborations, is probably unprecedented. And using science as a means to sort of send this type of signal is, of course, controversial on a more systemic level, and it is a paradox that we are sending a signal to despotic regime by reducing freedom of speech and freedom of information flows. But on a principle level, this has been complicated for many to sort of fully be on board on the way these sanctions have been implemented and how they have been designed. My impression is that from the scientific community, they wanted to be confronted or heard from governments before this policy was implemented. It was a very, very fast reaction. There could be more consultations between the scientific community and governments before it was implemented. And of course, there are really big frustrations on scientists who are working on projects that might have to be terminated because they have been relying heavily on Russian sources, on Russian data and Russian collaborators. That's also a clear issue here.
And I agree completely with what Ole said about the need to react strongly. But if you look at it in a global perspective, there are other threats to the world, for instance, climate change. And so I would presume that governments would be somewhat interested in also not disrupting the flow of data that can help us understand, adapt to, and mitigate climate change, and then make some compromises. But it's very difficult to do that when there is a war ongoing. So at least one should start thinking about what would be the issues and how can we get back to some way of scientific collaboration, which of course is difficult with a government in an authoritarian regime like Russia. But in any case, get back to some sort of a scientific exchange and collaboration after the war hopefully ends in the future.
Yeah, but I think even if the war should end tomorrow, there will be so much, cleaning up and so much mistrust being built between the West and Russia that it would take, I think, a long time before we will be back to a level of collaboration and trust that we had before the war started. There are signals. There's a great optimism attached to the Norway taking over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council, and I'm not saying this because I'm a Norwegian, but this is what I hear from other, both Finnish and American and other diplomats and scientists. And the foreign minister expressed at the speech in Tromsø that they would see if there were any possibilities of finding ways to at least keep some sort of dialogue or level of collaboration with Russia going. Because it's needed if we want to sort of preserve or save the Arctic Council. Russia has to be a part of it, and also if we want to preserve understanding of the full Arctic area, Russia has to be on board.
I think we should also bear in mind that Russia is increasingly militarized. So Russian institutions are not free in the sense that we know that our research institutions are free. There was a number of rectors of Russian universities expressed support of the invasion, So it's not so easy to build up trust in a situation where the institutions are not free willingly or unwillingly.
Yeah. One hypothesis, if this situation should become a long-term situation, is also that Russia will look more eastward, and also the Russian part of the Arctic, the eastern part, will become an area where other eastern states like China, India, which is relying more heavily on Arctic resources, will follow this up by collaborating more closely with Russia on Arctic science. And then you would have like a Western and an Eastern Arctic being built. But of course, this is a theory, and it's still difficult to predict the future.
Yeah, sure, but not unimaginable. I mean,
yeah, but also, but just one more thing I would like to add: the sanction regime sort of forbids institution to institution collaboration, but not person to person collaboration or scientist to scientist. But this is getting almost impossible, and there are no real incentives. So also the personal relationships that so many scientific projects are established upon, they erode, and friendships erode. So and this will become harder to re-establish if the situation should normalize or come back to where it was before the war at some point. So it further complicates things.
Yeah, I mean, that all makes sense, and it's obviously quite a depressing picture. I just want to dive a bit deeper into a couple of the points you both made about what's going on and the role of science in this broader geopolitical situation. So firstly, you mentioned about this paradox of using science to send a signal. And I see what you're getting at there, but I also wonder if that is really the whole picture. I mean, when you look at economic sanctions, they, of course, are partly about sending a signal, but they're also intended to actually affect Russia, to give them less money to do stuff that we don't want them to do. So if your international trade is reduced, then the idea is you can't get the money you need to make more guns or tanks or pay your soldiers or whatever. Is there not an equivalent element in science? Are we not denying Russia something they need somehow by cutting off scientific collaboration?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think Russia will have, within the scientific community, I'm sure there's a great frustration of losing collaborators and data in the West. And then we could also always ask the question whether this is important enough for the Russian government or Russian society as whole, the Russian economy, for this to be a big problem. I fear not that it has the highest priority within the Putin regime. The frustration that I mentioned also within the Russian Arctic science community, or the Russian science community, of being sort of locked out of the Western collaboration, might also bring them closer to the Russian regime or the Russian thinking. So
which of course is the argument often made against sanctions in general, right?
Yeah,
that you end up having the opposite effect by changing public opinion in the opposite direction.
Of course, and then we are also moving a bit more into like science diplomacy and as channels to influence the thinking in other countries.
Yeah, I think this isolation is probably not good if we want to support changes, regime changes or changes in the Russian thinking on the longer term. Of course, it has some implications to those who have Western contacts. But I would also think that if you look at the status of Russian research, it hasn't been grand. In a number of projects, the Russians haven't been leading the scientific development. They've been a partner, an important partner. What this does is that it undermines the quality of Russian research. And my impression is that the government doesn't really care. And we have, even before the war, lots of experience where the Russian military has stopped scientific expeditions on very vague grounds just because they are suspicious. So the military take precedence in many cases and is more important than scientific research or scientific breakthroughs.
Yeah, so you're not convinced that the sanctions, at least on science, are really hitting Putin where it hurts, basically. But then there's a risk, isn't there, that this can sound a bit like special pleading by the scientific community. You know, there are many areas of activity which have been disrupted by the invasion of Ukraine and by the sanctions and restrictions that we've placed on Russia. And those sanctions, broadly speaking, have been put there for a reason, right? Because the international community wants to try to stop Russia from doing what it's doing. And I think there's already some debate about whether we in Europe, in Western Europe, I should say, can really look the Ukrainians in the eye and say that we're on their side and we get what's happening to them. Oh, but we're not willing to, for instance, you know, send NATO planes to blow up Russian tanks or enforce a no-fly zone or whatever. I don't want to get into that debate. I know it's a big, complicated one, and frankly, I think it's not one that you or I are very well qualified to wade into. But my point is, in that general context, do you ever worry that it seems a bit strange to say, well, we scientists support and understand these sanctions in general, but not as they apply to us and our work because we think science is a special case? It seems like an uncomfortable place to stand against the backdrop of a massive and really brutal military invasion of a peaceful country. And what's to stop other people saying the same thing? You know, companies who trade in food or medicines or, I don't know, international sport or arts or cultural exchange, which are sectors that you also often hear railing against sanctions because they're supposed to be different and somehow transcend this stuff. I'm asking, like, are we comfortable arguing that science is exceptional and should be off the hook without opening the floodgates to a lot of similar arguments from elsewhere?
Well, it's not really, but there is a case in terms of the global significance of Arctic research, which I think, from a policy perspective, should be a part of this. But of course, everybody can plead their own case. But I think losing out key information on what's happening to our climate at least necessitates some thinking.
Yeah, I agree with what Eystein is saying. The war between Russia and Ukraine is horrendous. It's a horrible war, but it's a European conflict. But a much larger challenge that humanity is facing is the climate crisis. It looks now we will not reach the 1.5 degree target within time, and losing essential data in this effort to get there. It might, give us a bit more blurry vision of where we stand, and that is can take us in the wrong direction, or makes the time that we get there a longer time to get there. That's a stronger argument than just a commerce argument or collaboration, people to people collaboration, or these kinds.
Thank you. And since you mentioned that we might all collectively fail to do what we promised and limit warming to 1.5 degrees, do you think there's a danger also that Russia, given the current geopolitical situation, might give up essentially and perhaps pull out of the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, I think there's always a danger with a regime like that, and I'm not sure whether they follow their promises even now in terms of their economy, and they are doing whatever they can to not be hurt as deeply as they maybe should by sanctions, and that's the primary thing now, and I think that will happen for a while. I don't think we can rely on Russia to be sort of a leading country in terms of following the Paris Agreement. And I don't think anybody really did that before the war also.
Yeah, I agree. But with the costs of running an expensive war, I don't think this will be a high priority for the Russians, and probably don't see the international pressure as important as previous. But I don't think we will see like the US under Trump, that they will sort of withdraw from the COP agreement. I don't think, maybe just because they don't see it as important, and it will be more costly to withdraw than to just, stay within the regime. But I don't think this is not a priority for Russia.
And they also want to be friendly with some countries in the world which support the Paris Agreement. So I think that will only complicate the situation, which is bad enough as it is.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, look, more optimistically, you kind of hinted at this earlier, I think. Is there a possibility at all of science having a wider impact on global affairs here? This is like the optimistic view of science diplomacy, right? That science leads the way. I'm not suggesting that, like you say, an Arctic scientist is going to go to Putin and say, hey, you need to make peace because I need to measure the permafrost. And he's going to say, okay, I didn't think of that, my mistake. Okay, fine, we'll pull out of Ukraine. But, whether keeping some channels of communication open, keeping some degree of trust in at least this small corner of society when it's gone everywhere else, might actually be a big benefit when the war finally ends, touch wood, and there is a need to rebuild bridges and rehabilitate Russia somehow.
Yeah, I agree. And I think science diplomacy has something to deliver in this type of conflict, at least post the hot war, but also in other places. And there is lots of emphasis on science as one way of bridging gaps, both in the Middle East and elsewhere. So I think if one are looking for possible ways to open up at least some dialogue with countries that are difficult to deal with, I think scientific collaboration is an easier way than many other aspects of at least starting a process.
Yeah, and I think that despite all we have said about Russia just being focused on the military building themselves up as a military power now, there still are strong institutions and strong scientific milieus who are working on the Arctic, and the Arctic is high on the Russian agenda, more for commercial reasons than for scientific reasons. But you need the knowledge, you need the science to operate in this harsh conditions and the complicated conditions. And then, of course, knowledge from the rest of the Arctic and the rest of the world on Arctic issues would benefit the Russian Arctic development. And also, before Norway taking over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council for this 2-year period now in May, Russia held the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. And they don't, after their attack on the Ukraine, nobody attending their meetings, but they held their meetings, and they sort of committed to do their job as leading country as well as they could. So I think that's from the Russian point of view, they want to collaborate with other countries, I guess on any issue, but especially on the Arctic issues. So it might be definitely at some point that they will see the need for that and try to open up the channels a bit. But of course, the collaboration has not been put to a halt or stopped from the Russian side. It has from the Western side. So it's totally up to the West to say that now we are ready to collaborate. And there has been very, very strong statements that there will be no collaboration until the war has ended. So, yeah.
And there is one exception, at least. Norway is still conducting fisheries negotiations with Russia because we have a joint fish stock in the Barents Sea that needs to be taken care of. So there are some small cracks in this fence. So there is some pragmatism also on the Western side, but clearly it is a wall at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, so that's an area which I'm not surprised by. In a way, it's not surprising that no matter what else is going on globally, there are these local areas of collaboration and cooperation which just have to continue, because if you don't do them, you can't function. Like, for instance, negotiating fishing rights over areas of shared water. You just can't manage without it. A long time ago, I worked for a member of the European Parliament who was stuck on the Fisheries Committee, I think against his better judgment. He went once on a trip up to an area of the sea, it might have been the Barents Sea, which was indeed shared between Russia and Norway. And he went on the Norwegian patrol boat. They have these military patrol boats that patrol the area of the sea. And of course, the Norwegians have their patrols and the Russians have their patrols. And the agreement between the two sides is we will both jointly patrol these waters. And that agreement has been standing for decades, right? Since before the Cold War, similarly to the stuff we talk about for the Arctic. No matter what else has been going on in the world, no matter how cold relationships have been between the East and the West in general, these patrol boats have always had to get on and had to interact because that's just the job that has to be done up there. And he said that they had an agreement, a mutual agreement, that either side could board and inspect the other side for any reason. It was kind of a way of maintaining trust, right? You know, we allow you to board our ship whenever you want and we can board yours whenever we want. And he said that the way it worked out up there, because of course there was nothing actually going on, was that they had this unspoken agreement that whenever the Norwegians wanted some really good vodka, they would board the Russian ships and the Russians would say, okay, let's have a break now and we'll sit and drink vodka. And then on the other side, whenever the Russians wanted good Wi-Fi, which they didn't have, they would board the Norwegian ships and they'd use it to check Facebook, you know, and so on. So it kind of doesn't surprise me that these things have always continued despite the broader geopolitical situation. What does surprise me a bit, I suppose, therefore, is how come it hasn't this time? How come that wall you were just describing is so solid in the case of the Ukraine invasion? What's different now that means these sanctions are so hard-hitting and so far-reaching?
The reason that they might be unprecedented is that the last couple of decades, or from the 70s, we are much more integrated across borders as far as science collaboration goes. How enormously tight the internationalized the science community is today.
Right, yeah. So the consequence being that when these sanctions come in, they are much more disruptive than they would previously have been.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Are you aware of any pushback against that whole situation? I mean, maybe it's hard to imagine, but I'm thinking perhaps by analogy with COVID. When the pandemic hit in 2020, we all shut down our international travel. And at the same time, large parts of China were just completely shut down, you know, and suddenly we all realized in Europe that the stuff we needed to fight the pandemic, like surgical masks and equipment, that kind of thing, was all stuck in China where it was made. And we've become so dependent on Chinese manufacturing that we didn't have enough capacity in Europe or other parts of the world to make our own stuff once China was out of the picture. And so to try and avoid that happening again in future, there's been a lot of talk in Europe, and I imagine elsewhere too, about strategic independence. We need to stop relying on the globalized world for everything. We need to be able to put together a syringe at home, right, if push comes to shove. So there's now this kind of momentum towards changing how we do things longer term. I'm wondering if a similar argument is being made or has been made for science. If it turns out we can't rely on wobbly partners like Russia for our research, can we learn other ways to do it?
I haven't heard that said. This is the first time I hear that argument.
Well, I just made it up.
So I think the way science operates, it's very difficult to put it into silos. And in terms of the Arctic, you cannot create another Russian Arctic. It is what it is, and it is located where it is.
Yeah. So it was a silly idea in principle.
But it's a very interesting question. And we see, and it sort of goes back to what we talked about, the internationalization of, the internationalization of science in general, science collaboration. It follows a general trend of globalization and global collaboration, which has been sort of pulled back now, especially since Trump took over. We see the tendency of more like national thinking. So it's interesting whether it will have this kind of effects also on science. But we see it, of course, in more practical terms, that when we cannot collaborate with Russia, we find partners elsewhere because we want to collaborate on science across borders.
And I see it from my position in the European Research Council that it's of course constructed for European countries, but there is lots of interest from other areas of the world to somehow join or associate with the program because it's successful and they want to have that success also influencing the scientific community. That is in Asia, Australia, New Zealand, or other countries with a quite strong science base.
Well, we'll see. You know, as much as I always enjoy and I'm always interested by conversations I have on this podcast, I think it's rare that any of those conversations approach the stakes that we've been discussing today. This tension between broad geopolitics and the ability of policymakers to have access to the science they need to address an existential threat to our existence. So I'm really very grateful to you both for guiding me and the listeners through this fascinating, really important area, and for giving some hope for optimism among also a lot of very ominous observations, I have to say. So, Ole Øvretveit and Professor Eystein Jansen, thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure being here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
The Science for Policy podcast is created by Sapea. It's produced by me, Toby Wardman, with additional research and support from Agnieszka Pietruchuk. Sapea is a consortium of Europe's academy networks representing more than 100 academies, young academies and learning societies from more than 40 countries across Europe. We're part of the European Commission's scientific advice mechanism, and as such we're funded by the European Union. Having said that, the opinions you hear on this podcast are those of the guests, and sometimes mine, but certainly not the views of the European Commission. This music is composed by Carlo Alfredo Piatti and performed by Elizaveta Sushchenko, and this last bit is particularly good.